Michael, what do you make of these reports of Ukrainian forces making quite significant progress? British military officials are saying that Ukraine is making progress in offensive operations along both the northeastern and southern fronts and has consolidated a substantial area of territory.
There's no doubt about that. As you know, the Ukrainians took the strategic town of Liman on Saturday, the day after the supposed annexation of these territories by Putin, and that opened the door for further gains in the northeast, in the Donetsk area, in the Donbass. But also, they've been working steadily in the south as well, and they've made significant gains over the past several days.
And what do you think it is that has enabled them to turn the tide like this? Of course, they're getting military and training support from the West, but it does seem as though they suddenly seem to have managed to turn the tide against the Russian forces.
There are several factors which explain this success. The first is that the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives as Ukrainians. Putin is waging a war of war crimes with genocidal elements, and Ukrainians understand that. So they have no choice but to fight, whereas the Russian soldiers have no idea why they're in Ukraine. They realize there's a lot of nonsense coming from their government about this. Secondly, there's a command and control structure in the Russian military where all major decisions, and even not so major decisions, go back to generals sitting in Moscow, if not higher up than those generals. Ukrainian commanders on the ground have the ability to make their own decisions, so they're much more agile. And then three, as you mentioned, there's no question without the substantial flow of weapons into Ukraine from the United States, Britain, and other countries in NATO, Ukraine would not be able to carry out these attacks. But it's also true that Washington, less so London, has been rather slow and even timid in meeting some of the weapons requests that Ukraine is rightly asking.
And it does seem as though this could be a critical moment. We've got a US source quoted in one of the British newspapers in the morning saying that the US believes that Ukraine could actually retake Crimea if it continues to recapture territory from the Russian forces, which appear to be fleeing, at least in some parts of the country. Is that realistic? Of course, Crimea has been under Russian control since 2014.
Well, I am not a military man. I was a diplomat, although I worked closely with some former generals.
Sure.
I think it's possible. I'm not sure it's likely, especially if they don't get the other more advanced equipment that they've been asking for months. But it's also true that Russian morale is in the street, in the gutter, and the Ukrainians do have an elan, which makes this, I think, not impossible.
We're hearing President Putin talking about how the situation is going to stabilize in these regions where he has had these referendums, so-called, completely denounced by most independent observers. He has claimed some of these parts as now Russian territory. But even in these areas, which Russia now says are its, we're seeing Ukraine pushing the Russian forces back. What do you think President Putin means when he says that the situation is going to be stabilized?
I think either there's some major wishful thinking going on here by Putin, or he's hoping that his threat of using tactical nuclear weapons will intimidate Ukraine into stopping the counteroffensive, which it will not, or intimidate Ukraine's Western backers into stopping sending weapons and telling Ukraine to halt the counteroffensive, which I don't think it will either.
What do you make of those threats that President Putin has made? Because we've seen some US sources saying, well, we shouldn't assume that he is bluffing. And we had warnings going out to some NATO countries suggesting that President Putin might do something like perhaps carry out the test firing of some form of nuclear weapon near Russia's borders. What do you think is going on there?
Well, again, for certain, Putin is hoping that he can bluff the United States, NATO, and Ukraine into stopping their policies, which are helping Ukraine, and what Ukraine is taking back territory seized by Russia. So that's for sure. I think any sober statesman or woman needs to consider this as a real possibility. But also a sober statesman or woman should be familiar with the doctrine and practice of nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. And the Soviet Union was a much more formidable enemy than Putin is. And the United States did not let the Soviet Union intimidate it from defending its national interests in the two Berlin crises in the late 40s and 1961, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. Prime Minister Truss is right when she says that Putin's aims are not just limited to Ukraine. He wants to reestablish substantial Russian control over the whole territory of the former Soviet Union, which happens to include three current NATO members. So we need to stop Putin in Ukraine by sending the weapons and not let ourselves be bluffed into doing anything less.
There's another report in the newspapers here in the UK. Forgive me throwing these at you, but we're hearing that the Polish president, Andrzej Duda, has asked to have US nuclear weapons based on its territory. Now, you can perhaps understand why the country is so concerned that it might want that, but surely a move like that would be seen by President Putin as a further provocation.
I'm actually right now in Warsaw. I know that Poland, and for that matter, many of the eastern flank members of NATO really want to have U.S. troops as opposed to other NATO troops on their territory for obvious reasons. I have not heard this. So actually, I won't speculate on it. I'll just say that I tend to agree with you that there's really no reason for the United States to take that step. Our nuclear deterrence works whether our nuclear forces are located in the continental U.S., in the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean, or in any other spot.
Let me just ask you then about what is happening in Russia. Clearly, it's very, very difficult indeed to judge exactly the scale of opposition to what President Putin is doing, because, not least because those who do protest face lengthy jail sentences. We've seen people rounded up, thousands of arrests. But we have seen growing indications of unease, unhappiness, resentment and opposition at what President Putin is doing, including some of it from his more right-wing, hardline allies or former allies. What do you make of what's going on there?
Well, first of all, this is all a result of Putin's failed policy. That's where this hubbub is coming from. But it's also true that Putin retains control of the Russian media. He retains control of the forces of repression. So we'd be foolish to think that his regime is about to collapse. Yet, there is more instability right now in Russia than we've seen at any time since Putin took over 20 years ago. And the fact that senior members of his regime, like the heads of the Duma and the upper house in the Russian parliament, have criticized sharply the mobilization. The fact that more liberal-minded municipal authorities have called on Putin to resign, and the Uber hawks in Russia have called for the firing and even the execution of generals and the defense minister, all points to, again, regime instability. And the amazing thing about authoritarian regimes is that, especially to the outside world, they seem stable until suddenly they're gone.
Indeed. Sorry, carry on.
I was just going to, the final point is, folks who tend to be rather soft on Russia's aggression and saying Ukraine should make compromises that would leave millions of Ukrainians under the rule of Russians who commit war crimes. It's like to say that, well, if Putin were to depart the scene, we get someone more hardline. I think the history of Russia shows the opposite. When the leaders of Russia launch an unsatisfactory, a failed foreign war, they tend to be replaced by people who are more willing to open up Russian society and to liberalize things, at least for a period of time.
So, just finally, when we look at what is happening here, I mean, and you're there in Poland, which is, of course, very much on NATO's eastern flank.
Yes.
What do you think the response from the West should be to all of this? Should it be simply to stay the course, to carry on providing the support and the weapons and the training that Ukraine clearly does continue to need?
I think that we should increase our weapons supply to Ukraine. All the more advanced equipment that the Biden administration continues to say no on should be sent to make this counteroffensive more successful faster. Biden did well last week, and Jake Sullivan too, responding to Putin's nuclear threats. They basically said, we've got nukes too. If you do something with nukes, our response will be devastating. That's a very good message. But I think we should also say, if you're willing to pull your troops out of Ukraine, cease threatening Ukrainian territory, we're ready to have a much better relationship and to reach some sort of negotiation. And you have to deal with Ukraine to make that negotiated settlement, but we're willing to encourage that. I think we should send that message. But there's one more point that's very important I should have mentioned earlier. This is really Putin's war. It's really not the war of the Russian people, as those hundreds of thousands of Russian men who've left Russia since the mobilization show, as even Putin's Siloviki, most senior advisor showed in those strange videos just before he launched the major invasion. They didn't want this because they knew it would be a disaster for Russia, and for that matter, for the Putin regime. So Putin's kind of on his own with this.